Hello, and welcome to our weekly environmental news program. I'm Dale Willman. I run the Resilience Meeting at Columbia Climate School. This program is being produced in cooperation with the Society of Environmental Journalists. SJ sends out a daily email wrap of environmental news. It's free to subscribe, and they'll look for it at sej.org. So 10 years ago, it would be unthinkable to imagine Manhattan underwater, or that Wall Street would be an evacuation zone, which it was. The stock exchange would be closed for 2 days. But 10 years ago, the unthinkable happened when Hurricane Sandy made a direct hit on Manhattan. 17% of the city flooded. Power was knocked out. Almost a million people were destroyed. You may remember those images of lower Manhattan with that one little bright spot amidst the darkness, and hopefully we'll talk about that and NYU and what they did to create some amount of resilience. So over the past 10 years, $18 billion spent with a focus on recovery and resilience. Next week, a conference in New York will take a look at how that recovery is going. Today, we're going to talk about that recovery and what has been learned in the 10 years followed. And we're going to talk about resilience, what it is, why it's so important, and how journalists can find and cover resilience issues in their communities. Today, we have two guests. He's an urban designer at Columbia University. He works to integrate resilience and climate change adaptation into the long-term development patterns of urban areas. He's done amazing work in Africa and Israel and other places, and I'm excited to have him with us. And Rosemary Misdary reports on climate and other issues for the New York public radio station, WNYC. And a quick reminder to all of you, don't forget to stay with us through the whole program. We'll be discussing how you can localize the information we're going to discuss in your daily coverage. So journalists, this is important. And if you have a question, put it in the comments on the platform you're using to watch us. And we should be able to see that question and we can respond. So welcome, both of you. Thad, I want to start with you. Tell me, if you could, briefly, Sandy hitting New York and what happened.
Sure. Well, it's such an important time to have this conversation. These anniversaries give us a moment to reflect on lessons learned and to remember that moment. And I think it was a wake-up call for the city, for neighborhoods, for all of our institutions, and to recognize that we're in a new reality. The global climate crisis sort of came knocking at the door. We never had seen a storm like that in the past. There have been hurricanes in New York before, and people have short memories, but there was, and actually, according to the climate scientists, we had a sort of a lull in hurricane activity, in the latter half of the 20th century. There were more hurricanes before that. But with sea level rise and increasing, warmer atmosphere and warmer water in the North Atlantic, these kind of storms are getting more common and more devastating. And the other thing is our waterfront really changed. New York City is a water city, but over the last 50 years, there's been more and more waterfront development, suburbanization, the turning over ports into mixed-use neighborhoods. So, it was a real wake-up call. And it was
I think it's important to focus or to mention that water aspect too. I don't mean to interrupt, but that water aspect is important because I think a lot of people not from New York don't think of that, but a lot of us exposed, including the shores along Long Island. So there's a huge exposure risk from an event like this.
Yeah, I mean, New York is basically, there's only one borough that's part of the mainland. It's an island city. It's a coastal city, and a lot of the city was built on not compared to other coastal cities around the world, but a lot of it is built on landfill, which means it's not that much higher than sea level. And some of the most vulnerable neighborhoods are built on landfill, and that has a lot to do with the overlapping of environmental racism. Like neighborhoods like Red Hook or parts of the South Bronx, which were industrial areas, which were the only places where a lot of public housing was built, and other places around the city where there was the only kind of affordable housing or affordable home ownership opportunities for Black and communities of color. So, and those are the places that were most adversely affected. Some of the places that were most adversely affected by Hurricane Sandy.
So was the biggest surprise the damage to systems, to the basic systems that we need to function as a society, the power lines, the telephones, the water, the all the things that are important for, for what we call
Yeah.
civilization today. Um, that didn't seem to hold up very well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it exposed a lot of fragility in our systems for sure. Yeah, I think a lot of people knew that all of our power plants are on the waterfront, our sewer treatment plants, a lot of our subways, well underground, and a lot of the stations are in the flood zone. So yeah, there's a lot of systems that are vulnerable to sea level rise and increased storm activity, and I think in some ways, those, in the last 10 years, like now it's time to like look back and see what worked. And I think a lot of that hard infrastructure, there have been some really like hard engineering solutions. The systems that are really failing us are housing systems, to be frank. Like we have, I think, less housing today than we did at at the time of Hurricane Sandy. I mean, our housing market is a failing system, and I think Hurricane Sandy just sort of, like every disaster, just casts a bigger light on how horribly inequitable our system of housing is. So that's where I think the most fragility is in our economy.
So you both rode through Sandy. Thad, why don't you go first and tell us a little bit about what your experience was like, just briefly what that was like, and then Rosemary, I'd love to hear from you too.
Well, yeah, I was working. I was working at the Office of Emergency Management when Katrina hit New Orleans, and so I had done work at Office of Emergency Management and then New York City Planning of like basically focused on like what would happen if we got hit by a major hurricane here, and like where would people go, and where would people find housing. And I had done that work, and honestly, no one was paying much attention. There were a few of us working on it, but it wasn't like front and center. Bloomberg had these like sustainability plans, so we were like sort of aggressive on the climate change mitigation side, but maybe dragging on the climate change adaptation side. And yeah, and so I was working at city planning when Hurricane Sandy hit, and all this like sort of abstract ideas like what if that happened here suddenly became reality, and then in horrible ways, traumatic ways for so many communities. One thing, and so I worked then at the mayor's office on the recovery effort, that newly established housing recovery office. There's an interesting time to like, it was like, how do you spend all this federal money to help people get back on their feet? And Rosemary just did a great piece about one of the state's programs, the buyout program. But I think again, now it's a good time to like take stock of what worked and what didn't, and where we ended up. After 10 years, like, are our neighborhoods more resilient today than they were then? And yeah, I don't know the answer. So I moved from like government to sort of academia to ask some of these questions, and that's the intent of this conference next Friday, is to ask some of those questions collectively, and sort of socialize some of the lessons learned.
And Bobby, the comment on the screen there, the campfire survivor, I want to point out that we're talking about one example of resilience in New York City, but the things we're going to talk about are applicable around the country for other disasters, other community events that can threaten resilience. And we'll define resilience in a second. But Rosemary, why don't you tell me just a little bit about your experience with riding out Sandy?
Sure. First, I want to add something to what Thad said earlier in the beginning of the conversation, which is, another thing that puts this city at risk, and actually this goes for any place where people live, is that we love impervious surfaces. We love our sidewalks. We love our terracotta terraces. We just love building things that like keep us off the ground. And unfortunately, that creates increased runoff. And so in a city like New York City, which is, I believe the number is 73% impervious surfaces, where else does the water go when it comes down? It runs right off, and it'll either flood into a basement, or so it puts, there's more to it than just all this infrastructure. It's also that as a city, we have made ourselves even more vulnerable. And I will contradict that by saying that I think as a coastal city that we have not respected the water like we should. And I think that part of resiliency is respecting the fact that you live on the water and that you need to address what's happening with that interaction between the people who live there and what's happening with sea level rise or creatures living in the ocean. But my experience with Sandy was I was living in Long Island City, Queens, which is a block and a half from the East River. I was a half a block from the evacuation zone that the city had required. And I remember turning to my husband and saying, we're half a block from the evacuation zone. Should we stay? And he's like, oh, yeah, we'll be fine. And we had a 2-floor apartment, and a part of it was basement. And I had a 16-month-old child, and I had just given birth. And all of a sudden, in the evening, all the water, the sewage started coming up. It filled the whole first floor, the whole basement floor, and started coming up. And then when we went out into the street, it was just like a river. Cars were totaled. Like you couldn't really step on the street. The water was coming in so fast. And so it's, I think like riding out Sandy and seeing what happens. I know that people in Florida go through this all the time, but when you're in New York City and people are living all on top of each other and you see all of this happening around you and it's just like exponential. So it was a very intense experience for me, seeing firsthand what, how climate change could affect my life directly. So
and you know, you've pointed out something very important here, which is not the inability, but the difficulty in forecasting a major event like this. You probably felt somewhat safe knowing you were half a block away from the evacuation zone, and yet that didn't help you. It didn't really save you. Is your youngest nicknamed Sandy now?
No, but his name is Kai, which means ocean or water.
There you go. Good timing. And you know, well, Thad, I want to talk about impervious surfaces too, because one of the difficulties for journalists in covering these things is that journalists, like most humans, we focus in on the narrow. You know, we can only handle so much, so we want to take big issues and simplify and find little nuggets, whereas resilience is a complex issue. It's a systems-wide issue. I like to think of it in terms of sheds, water sheds, energy sheds, other things, and how resilience fits in that. But impervious surfaces is one of those things where it prevents water from percolating into the ground, so you're damaging, in some areas, you're damaging aquifers that should be recharged but aren't. A lot of toxics end up on impervious surfaces, motor oil, gasoline, other things that are then flushed off when the water comes through. So there are so many levels when you have impervious surfaces around, not just with storms, but with these other effects. So it's that complexity. So Thad, why don't you sort of give us a working definition of resilience? And it doesn't mean the ability to bounce back from a divorce or from a death in the family or something. That's not the kind of resilience we're talking about in this sense, right?
Yeah. You know, I'm sorry, I work at the Center for Resilient Cities and Landscapes, and you know, we use that term actually more like can we be learning, you know, from each of these experiences. So actually, it is quite very much like the behavioral psychology definition that you just referenced, at least in our estimation. But you know, these terms like sort of have been evolving. You know, like they're infused with meaning by like the context. And resilience has been like sort of a safe word for having a conversation about climate change in different parts of the world, and that's why we've used it. But frankly, we're much more interested in climate justice now. Like, I think, you know, the urban resilience movement was sort of like bringing like mainstream philanthropy into the conversation about environmental justice, which has been going on for decades. So I use it, you know, kind of sparingly, to tell you the truth, this word resilience now. Depaving the city is something I'd love to talk more about, though. Like, we need to just get rid of all this asphalt. Like, you know, we build a city for cars. And not for people. And, you know, I think that should be like the highest priority of a Green New Deal. Maybe not the highest, actually. I think housing probably the highest priority, but depaving the city soon thereafter. There's small efforts to do this by daylighting streams. There's some great stuff that the Department of Environmental Protection is doing with like cloudburst streets and other kinds of like more aggressive forms of green infrastructure. Planting all the roofs, but I think it needs to be like a major mobilization to depave the city. We need this like civilian climate corps out there just like hacking away at all the asphalt.
Well, a quick definition: opening rivers is, in many cities, rivers have been paved over, so it means daylighting means opening them up so they're accessible again to the public. So you've addressed something that I've talked about a lot too, which is the idea that we talk a lot about resilience, but there's no one working definition for it. So that's it. And while it does track with the personal resilience that I was talking about, but I see resilience as much broader. It's the ability of systems, of systems to be able to recover from disturbance. And Sandy showed that New York, in most instances, didn't have that kind of resilience, didn't have an ability to bounce back to the original form. But it provided an opportunity to redefine what that form might be, whether it's tearing up concrete or blacktop, or doing little micro energy projects. I referenced that little light in the middle of Lower Manhattan right afterward, and all the power was out, and that was NYU, which is a cogeneration plant where they had, I think it was natural gas coming in for their heaters, but they had equipment based on that, the cogeneration equipment that would take the excess heat and generate electricity. So they're able to provide electricity right after Sandy to the hospital down there and a few other key buildings. So that's an element of resilience, the ability to function in the face of a disaster. And to me, that's what resilience is. And again, all cities, all communities face these sorts of questions right now. And when we had the pandemic, one of the big questions was, everybody says build back, but what about build back better? What about build back differently? And resilience says you build back in a way that makes that community more resilient. So my question is, 10 years, has New York been doing that? Are they finding ways to make the community, whether it's a level or a systems level, making it more resilient to the next storm? Either one of you.
I mean, I'll just jump in real quick and say that, I mean, I've spoken to a lot of experts, and they've said that we are no more ready than we were when the storm first hit us. And we have all these great ideas, and we're just taking and it's taking too long to implement whatever plan, and there is no cohesive plan. Is another thing, is that like you have all these small, like the Department of Environmental Protection, it has cloudbursts, it's upgrading its sewer system, and then you have other agencies doing their own thing. But is there a plan overall so that we're not spending double money everywhere and taking forever to get stuff done? And I think that is like a really serious issue when you talk about that.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I think we're sort of worse off in terms of building local community resilience in particular. I feel like there's like more distrust between government and people, for instance, more like kind of different narratives that are allowed, that are propagated in the world that create divisions. Like some of the resilience building efforts have actually resulted in furthering divisions in communities in some ways. And I think we've got to learn and get better at this. It's really tragic because these issues are not going away. So yeah, I mean, that sounds very pessimistic that we're like worse off, but the challenges have actually gotten much worse. Like climate change, like we have failed in the last 10 years to like do much about climate change. Technology has not come to the rescue. I don't think it is going to come to the rescue. Our government has not come to the rescue. Communities are doing for themselves, and we need communities and institutions like mine at Columbia need to do more to support them. And I think we need a Green New Deal. We need to really invest in changing our infrastructure and housing in this country.
I wouldn't argue with all that. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Rosemary.
I was just going to jump in. I saw a comment on the chat that I thought was really interesting. I'm not going to call you out. It says, we all know that climate change is going to flood New York City. So you need to build whatever will keep the water back and build it up higher than you think you need it. And that's something that is also incredibly debatable. I know one of your colleagues at the Columbia Climate School, Klaus Jacob, is very much an advocate of managed retreat. And there's always an argument about, well, you're going to spend billions of dollars because a seawall is not cheap. And you don't want to build it so high nobody can see above the seawall. But then if you don't build it high enough, or you might have to replace it and spend another $1 billion years down the road. So why not move everyone around? So there's this big debate about, well, I don't know whether an engineering solution is the key or whether to kind of just acquiesce to the entire situation. So,
well, this is the question. What does resilience look like? So this is a good opportunity to bring in your story that you did with, I think it was Staten Island, right? With explain what managed retreat is. Retreat in general, which is a poorly named thing because it sounds like a failure when in fact it can be a huge success. But tell us a little bit about that story and what it resulted in.
Yeah, so there was basically there were these neighborhoods around Staten Island, and they're basically on the water. And historically, they've always flooded. They've always also had brush fires because they have these forests of towering phragmites everywhere, and they used to catch fire when it would get too hot during the summer. So these areas, if it rained a little bit, people would get water in their homes, and during Sandy, they were wiped out. And so the managed retreat program basically allowed these people, instead of rebuilding, they could sell their home to the state or to the federal government, whoever was running the buyout program, at market cost, and they would move to another to a area where there was no flooding. And so basically it's just the government buying you out of your flood prone home and what the government does is they take the land and either they might make it into a park, a soccer field, or just leave it abandoned so that it acts as a natural barrier for future storms. So. And
a sink, a way of storing that water, to collecting that water.
That's
so it
true,
doesn't, it's that impervious surface thing again. And your story was really powerful. The guy was talking about the water rising up and up in his home and even up to the attic. The only thing left was a box of photos and one other box of family photos and another box in his attic. And that's the only thing he had left after the flooding from Sandy.
Yeah, so, and it's funny too because people who were in Breezy Point, they had a similar experience, and that whole neighborhood completely rebuilt. So it's like just a dichotomy of like what's happening. So
excuse me. So let's introduce a couple other concepts. So the idea of resilience is, in a sense, building back better, and it's also preparing beforehand. So there are issues. There terms like mitigation, like adaptation. Thad, do you want to give quick definitions for those and what we mean by that?
Sure. Yeah. Well, mitigation is just referring to decarbonizing our economy. Reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, but adaptation is like dealing with the emissions that are already in the atmosphere, which are already adversely affecting the way we live. So they're both necessary, obviously, and it's hard to separate. Like when we talk about like planning, like urban planning or whatever, the two things have been too often separated. We should be doing both at the same time, and that's one of the things about these like flood walls. They're often sort of like single purpose infrastructure, and we need our infrastructure investments to do more. So there's and that's often what been called the the sort of definition of resilience, or what Dr. Judith Rodin calls like the resilience dividend, that like if you invest in a multi-purpose infrastructure, it will bring multiple like social and economic and ecological benefits.
But adaptation is more than just addressing climate change. It's finding ways to adapt to a changing world. So the managed retreat, the buyouts, the creating buffers, which they've talked about along Long Island, and I don't know where that process. I know there's one small area of Long Island where they were doing that, but I don't know if that's because this is the conflict. People love waterfronts. People love being down on the water and being able to see things, but those are the most vulnerable. So in this country, we have, the flood insurance program, which is subsidized by all Americans that help people rebuild in areas where we know we're going to go through this again. So this is where the buyout programs have come from. It's a way of adapting to the reality of the changing climate and the changing seas by doing these managed retreats. So that's one aspect of adaptation. So I want to put this up real quick too, because this is again, I want to say we're talking specifically about Sandy in New York, but many of the things we're talking about apply in other areas. And Houston, Texas, much of that built in wetlands, floodplains, and as Melissa points out, you put down concrete slabs and roads and things. It creates easier pathways for water to flow into more homes. So these are also other issues. So what have we learned from Sandy? Let's get back to that. What have we learned, if anything, about how we should plan in cities?
Well, I think that this learning has been sort of cumulative. I think there's the what, which we tend to focus on, like, we've mentioned some of these things about depaving the city, daylighting streams, looking for like, multi-purpose infrastructure, nature-based infrastructure, green infrastructure. That's all like the what, but I think it's the how that is also like problematic and, sort of challenges our notions of like who's responsible for this evolution ahead. And I think it needs to be much more of a all hands effort, frankly. Like, we're expecting the government to do X, Y, Z, and it hasn't happened in many cases, and it's really difficult for the government to act alone. Some people think, like the private market will solve all problems. Other people think like homeowners have to take it on themselves, and that's really challenging because it's really hard to separate out this climate crisis from our ongoing housing crisis and like decades of racial discrimination in our housing markets, and so so I feel like it's really complex. Like we have to do more multi-sectorally, but we also have to recognize that this isn't just about climate change. It's about failure of our economic system to actually provide decent lives for people.
Rosemary, anything to add there?
Yeah, I think what I learned from Sandy is that not only was I learned, and Ida reinforced that it's going to get a lot worse. Like if you think that my feelings were like, if you think that it's bad now, wait a few more years, and it's just going to keep getting worse. But also at the same time, we also have to realize that our city's infrastructure is aging. It's a perfect opportunity for us to pick up the pace and replace that infrastructure with stuff that we can actually use. Porous concrete. Okay, every time you need to throw the pavement down on a new road, why don't you put some porous pavement? Why don't you put more rain gardens along the road when it's time to fix up that road? Why don't we find ways to, as we're remediating parts of the subway with the new money we're supposed to get from congestion pricing, like why don't we find ways of replacing stuff, like build back better, basically, and I think that's kind of for me key to that. Something that I've learned is that now as we're replacing things, we can't do it the same old way we did before because we're compounding the problem and we're wasting money. So
Yeah.
Well, build back better basically means finding a better way to do things, but much of the money that's being spent under build back better is building roads and replacing bridges that may be problematic and other things. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is what have we learned? It seems like we haven't learned a lot from what happened.
Yeah, I think one thing is that it's like, so I was a city planner working on recovery after Hurricane Sandy, and I kept hearing all my colleagues and everybody saying like, this is a real opportunity to like, adapt or like to do better. And that's one thing we learned, is that it's not a good idea to try to like change everything after a disaster. Like, we need to do this work before the disaster. We need to start working with communities on adaptation plans now, and communities need to lead that effort. Individual like neighborhoods, and that they should be, given the resources and capacity to start to plan their own futures. Because after a disaster, like working with the traumatized community to say like, oh, we think, there should be all this change, when people are just desperately trying to get back to normal. It's not, this whole disaster is an opportunity thing, I think, turned out to be a horrible lie.
Rosemary, any bit of hope to come from that?
I mean, we don't have any choice but to have hope. So I'm just going to throw that out there. I mean, it's not like we're going to decide to, lay down and die tomorrow.
I'm sorry.
No. But I don't have anything to add to that.
Okay, it's a what I think is important is that this has at least started a conversation about these issues. There are many things that happened in New York that have changed things. There's something as simple as relocating or hardening. The Statue of Liberty, all the power structures for their elevators and everything else was below ground. So they spent a lot of money elevating that, I think 25 feet. So if it gets flooded again, which it certainly will, that those things that are so critical to its functioning will survive. So there's hardening as a technique, making things stronger so they won't collapse. But I'd still like to think about how we can.
Well, I think where I find the hope, honestly, is, and someone put this in the chat, there's kids are the hope. Absolutely. Like I teach, and my students have like an ethical clarity that my generation certainly lacked about these issues. But also I think that there's hope in the way that, communities have organized to take care of each other. And I think, in some ways, like we saw a lot of that during the pandemic as well. And so I feel like there's hope in our collective imagination to change the world. And I feel like that is happening. I don't believe it's coming through our current systems of power. And I think, we should recognize that there's enormous loss here. There's enormous trauma. And like Sandy, 10 years later reminds us that we're all experiencing in different ways this loss. And obviously some places are experiencing it much more. But out of that loss and this trauma, that we can find connection and community, and that and it really supposes like a radical redistribution of power in the way that we govern our communities in the future too. I think that's the other thing, is that like the way the composition of our leadership, of our institutions, of our government and so forth, that hopefully is also changing now, where we have more representation from the communities, BIPOC communities, for instance, that are most adversely affected by climate change. So redistribution of power is the hope.
So I want to move this more toward journalists and what they can take away from this, and how people in communities, smaller communities, how they can look for these things, how they can look for resilient stories, how they can find ways to address these issues about preparedness that we're talking about. So, but I want to first address, because we're talking about politics, other things. No mayor has ever been elected that I know of by saying, if I'm elected, I'm going to take care of our sewer lines. A lot of this is infrastructure and how we create infrastructure, how we use it, and how we design it. But it's never an issue. No one cares about their water lines unless it fails miserably. Nobody cares about their sewer lines, their power lines, unless they can't get power and their sewage doesn't go away. So I would argue that one thing journalists can do is start making these sorts of priorities. Many water systems around the country are on the verge of failing. There's a city very close to me that has wooden water mains that are well over 100 years old and that leak a lot of processed water, water that's been treated. As people out west know, who've been facing a chronic drought for a long time, you can't waste water, but a lot of our water systems do that. There are a lot of these sorts of things that can be looked at and reimagined from a journalistic perspective. But Rosemary, talk if you could a little bit about how you look for these kinds of stories and what are the sorts of things that you do to be able to report in these areas.
Well, one of the easiest ways to find these stories, I think, is like, city council, town council meetings. If you don't have a town council, which, I know there's a lot of small towns, you go to your county's council meeting. And when you sit through them, you will find out if your town or city or has any resiliency plans whatsoever and what problems they're encountering. They may not call it climate change, but if they start talking about something that is constantly flooding, they're talking about climate change. If they're talking about something in an area of forests that's in danger of fires constantly, they may not be calling it climate change. So you kind of, depending on where you live, they may not be calling those problems by their names. And so when you sit in these meetings, you'll be able to find out where your town is at. But I also know that a lot of federal money has already been distributed and will continue to be distributed, and especially with an emphasis in rural areas too. So these resiliency projects, the money is out there and these towns and cities will take advantage of them. Okay. Do you want to replace your road? Do you want to do this? And by following those at meetings or also just calling up the DOT, if you call up the DOT, you call up city. The way I get stories is I just call up the city agencies and find out what projects that are coming up. But even more than that, I think that climate change pervades every aspect of life. And for example, like if you're an arts and culture reporter, there are so many artists doing pieces and talking about climate change. And, if you're education, they're trying to electrify bus fleets in New York City. Okay, that's a climate change issue. So regardless of what kind of story we're talking about, there's always some sort of climate change aspect to it. So people dying of heat in the summer or people being rushed to the ER, that's a direct result of climate change. So you're basically surrounded by them. So
yeah, I'm trying to get journalists to think more in a resilient sense because to me, resilience is about systems, as I said earlier. It's about where your water comes from, where your food comes from, where your energy comes from. And those are all complex issues and they're ripe for a lot of investigation. But I just gave I talked to the newsroom at a paper out west that wanted to talk about climate. And I said, look, the first thing you have to understand is that climate's everywhere. You got to stop siloing and saying, oh, let's just talk about climate, because climate it's a health story, it's a business story, it's an economic story, it's a sports story. An example I gave was a recent study out of Salt Lake, one of the universities there, that looked at temperatures on artificial grass football fields and soccer fields. And they found the artificial turf with the increasing heat can go as high as, I think it was 170 degrees. It's not that far off boiling, whereas natural turf is 80 or 90 degrees cooler. That's a climate story. As places experience more extreme heat, it's a climate story, but you don't have to talk about it as a climate story. It's a health story. It's how our kids are playing their sports, or our young adults, or our college kids, or whatever. So thinking about about climate, not in terms of climate, but in terms of these other issues, is how you get more editors and more people engaged, because climate has become such a controversial term. In Florida, a lot of the reporters down there at the Miami Herald, at the public station, they don't talk about climate very much. They talk about sea level rise, because people go, oh, yeah, the sea level's going up, but they may not connect that to climate. But it's still, you can still do those stories in a way that you can help educate people. Someone, as Kimberly put in the comments, kids are getting sick. There are more climate stories with that, the health stories that are involved with this, the increase in smog and increase in other sorts of things. But, you know, Rosemary, you're sitting in the Adirondacks right now. I live on the edge of the Adirondacks. Power is a huge issue up there. Anytime a storm goes through, trees come down, take out power lines. It could be days that people are without power. Increasing storms means more trees down and more power lines down. These are stories about how we live and the way we live. So that may have sounded I was picking on what you're saying. I'm not. I'm just saying we need to broaden our vision for these kinds of stories to understand that it's about how we live. Climate is about how we live. And resilience is about how we live. And that's a great place to start too. So looking at where your food comes from. New York has done some really interesting things with warehouses in New Jersey that are using hydroponics to grow lettuce and other vegetables for consumption in New York. Rooftop gardens to collect rainwater, to slow the flow of that rainwater. We talked about impervious surfaces. Rooftops are like that. But also creating a garden where people can actually feed themselves. There's a lot of things when you start thinking in those shed terms. So energy, where does your power come from? Can there be microgrids? Is there more access to renewables that might not go down in a storm as much? So thinking in those shed terms is a way, I think, of getting our heads into a broader space that allows us to see more of these stories.
Yeah, and you know what? Like, for example, if you're, finding these stories can also be just knowing the lay of your land, that you're reporting on. If you know that there's a landfill, okay, on your site, it constantly has to apply for renewal, for air, and there's one in New York State that just recently is applying for expansion. Okay, that's a resiliency issues right there. Increasing the size of a landfill, okay, because it contributes to all the other problems that you have further down the road. And so I think that realizing the whole length of what climate resiliency is, from the source all the way to what we're doing about the results of all of our actions and how we try to further prevent worse effects in the future. So to me, it's like the whole game. And so and I think that finding these stories, you can be incredibly creative about it. Like, for example, if I moved into a new town and had to report on resiliency, the first thing I would do is I would find where the records office is and I would get the flood map, even if it was old, because I could look at the flood map and know it's just worse and larger. And from the flood map, I would find out where the low points are and I'd visit them. And I'd see what's located there. Is there a school there? Is there public housing there? Is there all where our food is stored there? Is there, and just simply by doing that, you can connect to so many different stories, human stories. Because the thing is, if you find like a whole neighborhood that's at the lowest point and you go and talk to them and you find out that they're basically underwater a lot of the time, then there's one story right there, that maybe has gone underreported. So sometimes actively trying to seek the data points can really help.
And then put them in human terms.
Yeah.
But that's looking for the flood map, even if it's old, is important, because if it's old, there's a story. Why is it old? Why hasn't it been updated? Thad, do you have some thoughts about how journalists can intersect with these issues?
Yeah, I just totally agree with those points that Rosemary was making. That it would be good to see more coverage of the fragility of our infrastructure in our neighborhoods before disaster. I mean, I wish I would have known about how bad the water situation was in Jackson, Mississippi before, it got on the newspaper. And I think people have often talked about, like, disasters get a lot of coverage, but then the recovery the coverage drops off. But what we saw in Hurricane Sandy and like every disaster is that it's really the recovery that's so traumatic for people. Like, it takes years. And that whole
And
story,
so important.
Rosemary's piece was great because it really, on WNYC recently, because it really showed that struggle for recovery.
Well, and in fact, if you look at environmental news coverage in general in the news media, it typically is about 2% of total coverage. The only time that changes is, for instance, I think it was 1989, which was Exxon Valdez, and it was Alar, this chemical placed on apples out in Washington that would make them ripen all at the same time so they could be more easily picked, but actually turned out to be potentially carcinogenous. News coverage, environmental news coverage spiked to about 10, 11% then, but it was crisis. It was disaster coverage. It wasn't the more nuanced, important stuff that helps people learn about that, which is exactly what you're saying. That is that the disaster got tons of coverage, but when it came to the recovery, there was an initial phase because of the big U, which was that putting the berm around New York and all those other $3 billion projects or whatever the cost was. And because it was new and exciting, but the down and gritty stuff coverage doesn't happen as much, which is why, as you say, Rosemary's coverage of these things is much more important. The issue of going to the documents too, I think, is really critical, and going to the city hall, going to the planning board meetings, because planning boards is where a lot of this stuff happens. We've baked in our planning codes a lot of things that are going to cause us problems for a long time, because the changing planning codes is often like a 20-year process, and they're designed in ways that aren't resilient. They're designed in ways that don't reflect what happens with disasters. Out west, they're finding this with homes built in the WUIs, the wilderness urban interface. Those that are most likely to be affected by fires. The building codes don't allow some of the things that might make their homes more fire resistant. And so those sorts of stories start in government, and it starts looking at those documents, and it starts by just digging to see what conversation, if any, is going on around these issues. I think I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and another really, I just realized this, like, if you're a reporter, you can call up the EPA, find out which region, because there's a regional person for each section of the country, and their press and public outreach people are super friendly. Seriously, you call them up. I'm in region whatever. I'm a reporter. What's going on in that region? Are you getting complaints of certain things? Is there a Superfund site within a certain radius? Are there any planned funds coming in? Is there anyone in my community? Because community organizations can apply for funding to do cleanups. So they can be an excellent source of stories. And sometimes they pilot stuff. You can find out what's happening in your immediate area just from calling up the EPA region, region that of your own personal region's representative. So
also USDA. Agriculture in most communities, especially in small areas, is critically important, and the cooperative extension agents. Every state has a land grant college, and they run a program called Cooperative Extension Agents. And they, in New York, it's, I think, by county. It's run out of Cornell, and they are often a wealth of really important and interesting stories too.
I mean, it's just to say that we are surrounded by all of these institutions and all these sources of information. And sometimes, like your local public library is an incredible source. And like, for example, for one story I did about sea level rise in Greenpoint, I called up the Greenpoint Library and found out they had a librarian dedicated to climate change there. That was regional, just specific to the area. And she had all this information for me. And she also had tips about what other stuff, because she has to keep up on this. So your librarian, even somebody as like could be a very good source. So
I love that idea. Thad?
Yeah, I just add, I think that the human element here like makes really great reading for a non-journalist. Like, I'd like to read about the librarian, and also just, that was my observation about Hurricane Sandy recovery, is that there were both established and emerging community leaders that were the real heroes in this whole story, even though maybe, elected officials or people with media apparatus behind them tend to suck up a lot of the attention. It's really those local stories about people, fighting to save their communities that where you can find really inspiring narratives.
And there are a lot of community places. I always encourage people to, talk to barber shops and beauty shops and church groups. I mean, these are places where people have conversations. A lot of community churches have study groups, and they might be looking at this issue. They might be looking at some element of these issues, and that's housing. There are groups near where I live in Saratoga Springs, New York, that are working on housing. That's a resort town that's very wealthy, and you buy condos for a couple $1 million there now, and rents on Broadway, the main street downtown, are at Midtown Manhattan rates. So it's kind of hard for all the workers who keep those businesses operating to find a place to live. So housing is a big issue, and there are a lot of community groups that are talking about this. So if you tap into those, that's a great way to find these kinds of stories too. And as someone in the comments mentions, schools. School boards. But I'd also suggest, and most journalists know this already, but it's not just about the planning board meetings and the city council meetings. In fact, those often, a lot of information doesn't come from those, but it's the people behind those. It's going to the planner's office, look for the flood maps, as you said, Rosemary, but also having conversations with those people and ask them what they think the big stories are and what's of interest in the community with them. We're getting close to time. Any other last minute thoughts? Any other ways that you think journalists could interact with these issues? Any last stories of hope?
You know what? My favorite, whenever I get stuck for a story, I love to call up the Department of Sanitation. Whoever picks up your garbage, you can get a break. And, solid waste is a big issue, and it ties directly to climate change and resiliency. If you're living in an area that's not trying to reduce solid waste, they're not trying to be resilient. And you can call up and find out, even if it's a private hauler, they keep track of how many cubic volumes they have to collect and of what every single year. And you can see that's a story in itself. If solid waste is increasing every year, and that's a big resiliency issue, because one problem feeds into another.
I think, so I'll just, there's a lot of lessons to be learned from the Hurricane Sandy experience in New York. So I'd encourage people to come to our event next Friday. It's hard to put one narrative to any given event like that. So we're going to hear from like 70 or 80 different speakers, and we're going to kind of collectively construct a narrative. And there'll be all different sorts of people in the room. I know that sanitation workers are going to be heralded as one of the great heroes of the Sandy recovery, because the Department of Sanitation did an absolutely amazing job. Maybe the only group of people that kind of came out of the whole experience as recognized for their great work. But there are many other important stories to be told, and from regular people just getting through this terrible event. So I hope people can join for the event next Friday.
And before we wrap up, Rosemary, in the comments, someone asked, and it's a good question, if you could talk a bit about how you use artists as a potential resource for stories.
Oh, you know what? One of the most important things about, climate change was a beat that's only about a year old at WNYC, and we basically all sat down at the science desk, and we thought, what do New Yorkers need to know? And we decided they needed to know what was going on climate change wise in New York City, because we don't have big fires. We're not worried about droughts. We have a different set of worries. And one of the really important things was finding different voices in talking about climate change. Like, I love the climatology experts that I've spoken to, all the ecologists, the marine biologists. But the thing is that there are other voices that can also deepen the conversation on climate change. And I think artists I've always thought that the work of artists, whether they're musicians, visual artists, performance artists, are kind of really part of our collective consciousness and have the ability to really dwell on a lot of the emotions and the things that we feel as a society but can't like actualize. And I'll just share with you really quick, like one recent story I did was about this woman who would go into the water, into the East River, and she would stand there for like 16 hours until the sea level rose all the way up to her chin and then completely receded as kind of a symbol of sea level rise. And she invited people to come out with her, and lots of people joined her and stood out in the water with her. And to me, that was a really powerful image of like, to me, that's like even more powerful and catching to somebody who is not maybe a scientist or who thinks climate change is above their head. And they see that and they stop and think about it even more. Like, why is this person standing in the water and like, and trying to make a statement about sea level rise? Is it that serious? And then you get conversations happening. And so to me, whenever I find out an artist or a museum is doing some sort of climate change themed work, I jump on it right away because it's another way of entering the conversation. Like it's a way of having a conversation that isn't just gloom and doom. It's about like more, more nuanced. So I don't know if that answers the question. But I think they're amazing sources because like they're really trying to process that. Like I think somebody put in the chat that, people are in denial. I don't know if people are in denial, but I think they're maybe in denial of what needs to be done. Okay. And when I see artists who tackle climate change as a theme are not in denial. And so seeing that kind of confrontation publicly is just an amazing way to bring it to other people.
My friend Michael Snyder, who's an amazing photographer, does a lot of climate work, has a project where he has people standing near the shore holding a measuring stick that shows where the level is projected to be in the future. And it's very powerful, a lot of these photographs. It's one thing to talk about it and say it'll be up 3 feet, but to actually have a measurement showing this will all be underwater is a very powerful statement. So one last thing I want to throw out before, I've been thinking about this throughout this conversation, is the book Cradle to Cradle, Will McDonough, if you can still find it. When I read that, I found that to be an amazing book. It's the idea of manufacturing in a process. We talk about cradle to grave, but this gets to your landfill question, Rosemary. The question is, how can you manufacture in a way that it mimics nature, biomimicry, so that anything that's detritus, that's the end of a cycle for one thing, becomes feeder stock for something else. So you have a power plant that has scrubbers that remove sulfur. That sulfur goes to the match plant. That's not a great example because it's not a complete closed loop, but closed loop manufacturing basically would be one way of resolving many of the issues that, at least several of the issues that we've been talking about. So I recommend that book to anybody who's interested in that. So we're out of time, but Thad, Rosemary, thank you so much. It's been a great conversation. Rosemary, I love the work that you're doing, and look forward to seeing more. And that's it for the program. Next week, Andy Revkin will have our program. And if you want to rewatch this one or any other program in the series, check out Andy's YouTube page. Thank you all for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful weekend.